America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome back to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we are joined by Erika Sanzi. Erika is the director of outreach at Parents Defending Education. She's also a former educator and an elected school board member. She joins us to discuss her latest op-ed about parents moving to the right and President Trump delivering on his promises to parents. Erika, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, tell us about your organization, Parents Defending Education, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so Parents Defending Education is a 501c3, so sort of a nonpartisan nonprofit that launched in 2021. And really in response to what our president and founder, Nikki Neely, saw as a shift towards the suppression of speech in schools, a shift towards what seemed to be almost dogma in schools, and also egregious violations of federal law around treating students differently based on their immutable characteristics. So just to give people an example of what it was that caused her to finally say, okay, we need to do something. The superintendent of the Evanston schools, which is right outside Chicago, he put in writing during COVID that they were going to make determinations about which students could come back to in-person schooling and which students would have to stay remote. They were going to make those determinations based on two factors, and they were race and sexual orientation. And the argument was that these were historically marginalized groups, and in order to make up for that marginalization, they were going to bring them back to school sooner. So what that meant was, number one, why are we talking about the sexual orientation of students in K-12? But putting that aside, that would mean that an accelerated student or who was not struggling would get to go back if they had the right skin color or sexual orientation. And the student that was really struggling and needed the extra support and remediation of in-person schooling was going to be left at home if they didn't check these boxes. So we launched again in 2021. Much to the chagrin of some parents, we did not engage at all on issues around masks or closures. We weren't a COVID organization. But what was connected to COVID was that the problems we were seeing, again, around compelled speech, suppression of speech, and a fixation on race, gender, and this sort of this social justice bucket, that was being revealed to parents because their kids were not in school, they were on Zoom. And so suddenly a lot of the craziness that was happening behind closed doors in the schools was suddenly being broadcast through the laptop at their dining room table. So there was definitely an overlap, but we were not an organization that was out fighting mask mandates. We were an organization that felt like the free exchange of ideas had disappeared from too many schools. And that there was no political neutrality anymore. And that even to ask a question that would have been a totally normal conversational thing a few years ago was suddenly being described as hateful by school staff and by school board members.
Yeah, I get the connection to COVID. I think COVID is, as negative of consequences that it brought, the things that have come out of it on the education side for our kids are these revelations about what our kids were being taught, what was being said to them. And many times, I guess our kids really didn't know to come home and say, hey, mom, this just doesn't sound right, or they just, how's your day, honey? And they would say, fine, like a normal teenager would say, and you don't get anything out of them. But what was really happening, we were suddenly witnessing real time on Zoom. And so I love what you guys have done and your focus. You wrote this op-ed in Real Clear, and it talks about parents moving to the right, pundits panicking while Trump delivers on education. You say in your op-ed that that parents actually with school-age children influenced the election, shifting 7 points to the right between 2020 and 2024.
Yep.
Talk about the issues that you think directly impacted that. And I know you did a poll too, so you can talk a little bit about that also.
Yeah. So because I had my ear to the ground, and because it's kind of my job is to sort of like have my ear to the ground on this stuff, I kind of saw this Trump train coming as it related to K-12 education, which is to say, I saw a parent reaching a boiling point, and it was not a partisan thing. Certainly, conservatives and Republicans had gotten to that point quicker and faster and were more aware of it because they were more willing to sort of acknowledge that it was happening. What we saw among a lot of independents and Democrats earlier, like in the 2020, 21, 22 timeframe, was this sounded way too crazy, so this couldn't be happening. Or if they were hyper progressive, then they would be like, this is awesome. This is exactly what I want for my kids. But as time went by, what we noticed was rather than getting tons of private messages and texts and DMs from lifelong Democrats saying, oh my God, this is crazy what's happening in my kid's school, we started to see more of them sort of like break through and begin to articulate their concerns. Maybe not broadcast like to the world, but certainly they were a little bit more willing to talk about it as opposed to being terrified that they would be excommunicated from their social networks if they said anything. So again, it seemed to me that that it was like I was seeing almost like a crescendo where it was like people were sort of getting ready to say, okay, this is too far. And certainly the issue of males being allowed to self-identify into female athletics, that was definitely one thing that I think really got people that were sitting on the sidelines to finally be like, I'm done. So after the election, of course, we didn't know really what had happened in terms of the numbers, but after a little while, we were able to see that there was a 7-point swing among parents with kids under 18. So essentially that's schooling age. And that was a 7-point swing in 4 years. So from 2020 to 2024. So that seemed really significant. So then we commissioned a poll to ask some questions so we could get a sense of where people were landing on some of these issues. And unsurprisingly, the poll definitely confirmed what we saw in the election. And again, like I kept saying, I saw this coming, but I didn't really have any way to prove it. And what we saw was just overwhelming numbers of parents, not only conservatives and Republicans, but independents and Democrats that were opposed to things like schools withholding information about gender identity from from parents. So even if it's your own child who's literally like existing as the opposite sex all the time at school and in school activities, the policy in most schools around the country is to withhold that information from the parents if that's what the child wants. The other thing that we saw was if you asked about, wanting schools to focus more on the basics, so that would be math, reading, writing, civics, whatever, that number was over 90%, that they wanted them to get back to more of a focus on academics. And also something a lot of people may not be aware of, but in this world of social justice and equity, which sounds so good until you dive into how they're defining those things and what they're doing. Two things that we were seeing were around grading and around discipline. So the grading around equity was, we're seeing these gaps, again, anytime they're seeing gaps among groups of students, they want to eradicate the gaps. But the problem is eradicating gaps means a lot of things in the child has to change. But the school doesn't have the power over that. So instead it becomes, well, we're not going to count homework anymore. Well, we're not going to give zeros. So what a lot of people did not realize is that students receive credit even if they do not even turn in anything. And And again, there's a debate to be had about the student who is consistently doing their work. Something happens, they have 1-0, and it completely pulls their grade down. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about policy.
Right. Because I have a friend who's a teacher in South Florida. And when it came out publicly, and this was, like during COVID as we were trying to recover, is the same thing. It came out publicly that they didn't give zeros. They didn't go lower than a D, even if you didn't turn anything in. And I asked her, I said, is this true? Because the school was denying it. And the school board, the county, and I asked her, and she said, yes. And the reason why is because it's so hard to recover from a 0, that once you get that 60, that's bad. Like, it hurts, but a 0 is impossible to recover from. Sounds logical, but I see what you're saying. You have to punish the people who do well, to help the people that do nothing. And that's it. You can't have equity like that.
It also takes away the agency of the teachers, right? I taught for over 10 years. And obviously you have a student who never turns anything in and does no work and doesn't come to class. And this idea that you have to give credit, right, and pass them in the class, that does sound insane to most people. And that is not good for that child, right? So this idea that you're helping them, I would argue you're not helping them. Then you have another student who consistently does everything, but for whatever reason, like had a bad breakup with a girlfriend or a boyfriend and just like was a hot mess the day of the test, or, whatever, like things happen. I had these things happen. Those are very different scenarios, and teachers kind of need the agency to be able to, these are grownups, right? They can use discretion. The problem was the school district passed these policies in the name of equity that they couldn't give zeros, they couldn't fail anybody. And then the other thing that's even in terms of safety, which is much more alarming, is they also, because there were big gaps in the number of students being expelled or suspended. So again, you have like Asian students have the least discipline issues, right? So you're going to see the lowest number of suspensions around that group. And then it goes down at white students, I believe Hispanic students, and then Black students. Now, nobody ever talks about the gaps between the Asians and the white kids, because those are two populations that are seen as, they're in that privilege bucket. So that gap doesn't matter. But for the other students, and so what they would do is they really needed to find a way to juke the stats. I hate to say it, but that's what they had to do, right? Like if our numbers don't improve on suspensions, we risk losing our federal funding, because that's what President Obama told us would happen. So they try to find ways to keep students in the building. Now, again, there are situations, right, in which a written policy doesn't have enough flexibility. So I always give the example of or when people talk about restorative justice, and most of us cringe when we hear it. Well, if you're talking about safety, yes, we should cringe, because it doesn't work in this case of kids being unsafe and they need to be taken out of the building. But when my student, and you guys probably have known people or have kids where there are kids that are extremely fidgety, they love to touch things and they like to take things apart without permission. So when my student, grabbed my stapler, just as they were, nothing malicious, next thing you know, the stapler is in 25 pieces. And then now restorative works there, because you say you have two choices. You either put that back together so it's working again, or you replace it. That works, because no one's safety is at risk. You're not talking about keeping violent students in the building, and you're not talking about a kid who is chronically disrupting a class so that other kids in the class can't learn.
Right.
So, but what we saw again was that any discipline, we would probably say you really shouldn't be taking a student's race into account when you're making a decision about how to discipline them. So the fact that you're going to say, well, because our numbers don't look good, we're going to administer this punishment to this kid and this punishment to this kid, even though they did the exact same thing. That can't work. And that was the policy, was called disparate impact, for the people who want to look it up. So again, parents didn't like that. In our polling confirmed, they didn't like the idea of kids being graded at all differently or having lower expectations based on race or any other criteria, and they didn't like the idea of kids being disciplined differently, again, based on these immutable traits, even if it was going to make the school look better and their stats were going to be looked upon more favorably by the administration that was in office.
It's really interesting seeing this shift to the right among parents, because as long as I can remember, education's always been the stronghold of Democrats.
Yes.
So it really is this huge political shift. And thank you for calling it out in that piece. And it's really amazing that Democrats have ceded this constituency.
Can I just say one thing just for listeners? Yeah. That was a 21-point advantage.
Yeah.
So it was a massive advantage that began to erode whenever the year, right when Glenn Youngkin ended up being elected in Virginia. That's where we really saw it start to close. It went from 21 points to 6 points. And so I think we're just kind of seeing further movement, but it is 100% an issue that they had that. I mean, the Democrats had that issue and it is just evaporated out of and I would again argue this is COVID and it's also schools just going like way off the reservation on this sort of equity, social justice front where again, if you could point to improved outcomes, we could have a debate, but we don't see that.
Yeah, that was my next question. The rubber's really hit the road here in terms of this woke ideology. Can you tell us a little bit about the recent national test scores and to what degree do you attribute this plummeting performance to wokeness replacing the 3 R's?
Yeah, I mean, we began to see so everybody loves to talk about how No Child Left Behind was horrible and they all hated it. But what it had in it was accountability, and it definitely was that we were seeing these gaps close in terms of largely around race and income, which are where we generally see, the biggest gaps. Around 2013, we began to see results started to get worse. And then during the Obama administration, when they went from No Child Left Behind to ESSA, ESSA, I think Every Student Succeeds Act, that pulled out some of the accountability measures and we began to go downhill more. And then I feel like COVID kind of blew up the whole thing. So the results, I'm trying to decide if I was like surprised by them or not. I mean, on the one hand, there was $190 billion infused into K-12 school system by the federal government during COVID. So to have infused $190 billion with no strings attached, that's a problem. And see no improvement, that's kind of staggering. And so one has to say, I keep hearing about how if we just do this equity stuff, kids will do better. If we just do this social emotional learning, kids will do better. All of these expensive sort of, I don't want to use the word woke because that's not the right word, but all of these expensive products that districts buy from third-party vendors that then they say, oh, it's evidence-based. If we just do more social emotional learning, kids will do better academically. If we just, get rid of honors classes and we mix everybody together, kids will do better. If we just stop giving zeros or we stop counting homework or we don't care that they're late to class, kids will do better. But what we've seen is that they're not doing better. They're doing worse. And the most alarming thing that probably people don't realize, because you have to kind of really like dig in and look, there are 4 levels when they test every 2 years when they do the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is referred to as NAEP. Also the nation's report card, you'll hear it called. There's 4 scores. You can get, you can be above proficiency or exceeds proficiency. Tiny percentage of kids get that. Then there's proficiency. And again, a minority of students get that, but it's a bigger number than the tippy top. So let's say we have a third of students, I think our quarter, now I forget which it is, but a small chunk are proficient or better. Then there's basic, which means like you show some signs that you're approaching proficiency, but you're not there. And then there's a category called below basic. And this category is like very alarming in terms of what it shows that students do not know. And in the results that came out a couple weeks ago, we have more students in the below basic bucket in math and reading than ever in the history of when this test was began, I believe, in 1992.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as any parent can attest, teaching math and reading to kids is hard. And from what I can guess, putting on a slideshow presentation about equity and filling all your lessons with social justice stuff is easy, and it gets you through the day. I'm not calling teachers lazy, but it's just human nature that this garbage would start to cannibalize the hard work that needs to be done to teach kids the skills they need to succeed. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, the other thing is teachers are being pressured to do, I mean, they are another big ticket item are the teacher trainings, and the teacher trainings now are steeped in all of this. So to the point where it's not just we're going to like make you talk about your race at work, or we're going to like, tell you that it's your fault that all of these horrible things happened in the past, but we're going to also tell you that you need to do X, Y, Z in your classes to align with our priorities of equity, etc. It was interesting. I was on, I did an interview with some TV outlet last week, and the other guest on with me was a math teacher, I think in New York, and he teaches high school. And he said one of the biggest problems is that the students in his class do not know the words that he is using in a math class. So he said, I have to use words like ascend or declining. And he said, my students are so far behind that they don't know the vocabulary that I, as a teacher, am using in a high school math class. Which didn't surprise me, because look at the literacy results we just saw. But that's a change. I don't think many high school teachers from 20 years ago would be saying that they had enough students that didn't know those words that they were going on television to talk about it. I mean, that's how big of a problem it is. And so, I mean, the math results were terrible also. But in his case, he's also like, I can't even use basic vocabulary with high school students at the moment because of how far they are behind. And he did cite the disruption and the COVID stuff as where he saw this totally go off the rails. The other thing too, like, and I know you guys will probably agree with this, like there's never one reason why things are happening. So like when people say to me, well, don't you think the cell phones play a role? Totally. I 100% think that people's ability to focus and their attention spans are like eroding. I see it happening in myself with my own, phone and the video clips. And, suddenly I'm like, why am I using a GPS to go somewhere that I've been 10 times? So I do think that, so when teachers are like, I think it's a perfect storm of you disrupted their schooling, you closed their schools, you put them in hybrid schooling, you put them on screens. My district went 1-to-1 Chromebook, so they pay for every student in the district to have a Chromebook, which means the kids are on a screen like all day. And they brag about that. Like that's like something that we as a district think is a selling point, right? That everybody has a Chromebook. We spent so much money on that. We're 1-to-1. Well, in hindsight, I think people are probably like, that was dumb, because this whole being on screens thing just isn't, I don't think it's good. So I think it's the screens and the phones. I think it's the COVID disruption. And I think it's this total shift away from the focus on the basics of what students need to know. I mean, to me, it's like, I'm actually working on an op-ed about this, because I'm like, at this point, if you cannot achieve your basic function, right? You're not teaching them how to read successfully. You're not teaching them how to do math successfully. There are a million factors as to why that's not happening. The school is not the only factor, right? Like we can easily look and see certain groups of kids spend a lot of time doing homework. Certain groups of kids do no homework. We know that students that are in a 2-parent family have more success in school than students who are not. Like the schools cannot fix that. But if your focus is going to be more about, we have to provide all of the meals for the kids, and then we have to be sure that they can get their immunizations here, and then we have to be sure that we have wraparound services, and then we have to be sure that their mother can get her eye exam here too, and we're going to check their make sure that their teeth have been checked. Like at some point, you've overloaded the plate of the school to the point that you've set them up for failure, and there's no reason to call them schools. These are social services hubs. And I mean, I've talked to school leaders a million times. When COVID happened, the first thing they all were scrambling over were meals. Now, nobody wants a child to go hungry. So when people clip this and say, Erika Sanzi doesn't think that kids should be given food, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when a school shuts down and the number one thing that they're focusing on because they have to by law is meals, like, what does that really say about, like, it's almost like they've been put in a position where they can't focus on the academics because they've been tasked with and obligated by law to do all these other things. And I just think that's impossible.
Yeah, I can remember during COVID, my daughter was in her junior year when her school shut down. And the big issue was that they would be handing out breakfast in the morning, and you could do like a drive-by as a parent to go pick up your meals for the kids. So yes, I mean, think about the logistics of that during COVID.
Massive.
To set up, the teachers coming in to hand out the stuff. Meanwhile, people are getting COVID and having to isolate, and all of that was going on. You're right. I didn't look at that from that perspective. I also wonder about just sort of a thought that entered my head when you're talking about kids being on screens all day. I wonder what the increase in eyesight and hurting their eyesight, more kids wearing glasses as a result, and the costs associated in the healthcare system if you're staring at a screen all day. Here, how much that impacts your eyes. I know it hurts mine.
I was going to say, I don't know about kids because I haven't looked at that, but my eyes feel like they're just constantly getting worse. What I will say, there is very good research on, as opposed to fake research, which is what they cite for all of the social emotional learning garbage, that the retention is just not nearly the same reading on screens. And a lot of kids will or adults too, we reminisce about how much by taking notes on paper, people could remember information better. And they could even remember, I'm taking a test and they knew exactly what the notes looked like. So because there's so much more happening on screens, the retention isn't there. You see almost no flashcard use anymore.
Right.
And
we all learn differently. We all learn differently. I used to go to class in college and take notes, shorthand and scribble, scrabble, and whatever I could do to write down everything I was being said. But then I would go home and I would organize those notes and rewrite them. And it would get in there. And that was part of my learning, my way to learn. Other people could just listen and retain it all. I had to write it down. So
it's
everybody
funny
learns differently.
It's funny too, because everyone I know who did that is a girl or a woman. And I have 3 sons. And it is funny, when I talk to people about their study habits back in the day, the copying over of the notes definitely seemed to be something that conscientious girls did. And then when I asked the boys, they're like, what? I never did that.
That makes sense though, from a girl boy difference.
Yeah. So it's because I know, and then I guess I would also say, because, I am Parents Defending Education, but parents also don't get a free pass here. So what I've also been hearing from a lot of people is that this idea of I, the parent, get to determine everything. And that's not a realistic way to think if you have your kid going to a school that's run by, if you're homeschooling, that totally does make sense. But there are times where I feel like parents absolutely get to direct the education upbringing of their child. I totally agree with that. And I also feel like we are way over, when there's obscenity and profanity and lessons about gender and sexual orientation in schools, especially in the early grades, to not have opt-out mechanisms is insane because they shouldn't be there in the first place. But I also will say that as with everything, there's a backlash. And so now I sometimes see parents like almost swinging from the schools went too far, you're not respecting us, to almost now a little bit swinging in the opposite direction of like, I'm going to go online. I'm going to write terrible things about the teachers by name. I'm going to write terrible things about the nurse. I'm going to, try to make these people's lives a living hell in the name of parental rights. And like that is making it so much harder for school districts to function and to serve kids and to improve.
Well, we're also seeing this push towards, so if you're a parent who wants to be more in control, and whether it's homeschooling or parochial school, private school, whatever it is, public school, we're seeing the move towards parents of all backgrounds.
Yes.
Want to have school choice.
Yes.
And we call it at Job Creators Network, we call it education freedom. And we're pushing for what we call universal education freedom, so that the tax dollars follow the student to wherever those parents want to send their kids, so that you can have more control, you can have more choice. And if you feel like the school isn't providing the needs of your child, that you can take them and put them somewhere else. And in the consequence of that is that all education should get better, because all of these different types of learning environments are going to be competing for those dollars. And
Yes.
we know in any free market system, it gets better when you have competition. And so are you seeing that kind of demand from parents? And do you see that, do you believe that you're going to see more choice going forward in a Trump administration in as far as what he has promised parents?
Yeah, I mean, so I have been an education freedom advocate for many years, including when I was on an elected school board in 2010. I was promoting our local charter school, and I was promoting parents having options as a sitting school board member, which you can imagine is not a very popular position. The other thing I would say is that I live in a rare district where we actually had a charter schools open, and we saw, despite everyone hating them and there was a massive fight over it, our school district improved dramatically. Mm-hmm. The competition was such that in one breath, everybody was, angry and mad about the charter. In the other breath, things went into high gear in the district, and they've moved up a lot in the rankings, and we've seen, much improved academic outcomes. So that's like because people always say, well, that's not really true. I literally lived it. I kind of watched it happen in real time. It's weird. The parents having more educational options has been popular with parents forever, and it is most popular with Black parents and Hispanic parents. So it's strange that a party that has kind of over relied on those groups would be so against something that these parents want. I mean, it gets up to, I think it's almost at 77% is like the percentage, the last one that I saw. So, I mean, I can remember when I see the candidates sort of just wrapping their arms around the unions and vice versa, and then I see the parents on the ground clamoring for more options, it's like a total disconnect. So I think that it is on the ascendancy, choice or educational freedom. We've seen a ton of bills pass. That I do think COVID really was the catalyst for that. Because I mean, to see kids going to school a mile away at a private school or in Florida, and then your school is closed for 18 months. I just think that, again, like this was an area too where, and this point's been made really well by other people. So I'm kind of like stealing other people's commentary here. Like Jarrell Bradford, for example, is somebody who's made this point many times. When you only have like low income parents clamoring for something, i.e. more options for their kids because they're residentially assigned to lousy schools, they have very little power, right? And we could argue too that when those are low income parents of color, they have very little power. What happened with COVID, and I think this is true, this was the first time that more middle class and upper middle class parents for whom the system had worked well enough, right? They weren't in these like atrocious schools that had failed for generations. It was really the first time that those parents like found themselves walking into that brick wall that other parents had been walking into for so long. So if you were a poor family and you're assigned to a terrible school and you have no options, you're like getting the door slammed in your face constantly. COVID made that door slamming in the face phenomenon. It broadened it out to a lot more people. So suddenly you could have been like a person living in $1 million house in Fairfax, Virginia, but your school's not open, right? And your school board's insane. And you're not just being told no, you're being called terrible names because you have an opinion about a school not being open or about masks. So I think that what happened is that it's hard to get a groundswell of support for parental rights when you only have like this lower tier of parents that are in dire circumstances. Because when in history have the people at the bottom been able to like really, really bring about change on their own? By adding that other layer of now people with more political power who are saying, oh my God, these people are the biggest jerks. They won't even listen to me. They're slamming the door in my face. They're calling me a racist. They're calling me a transphobe. They're calling me hateful. Like, you got this army of parents. And that's what we've seen. And that's why when I get I'm kind of over it, I guess, but it's just frustrating to hear it always be right-wing, conservative, Republicans. I'm thinking, if you saw the groundswell of parents that I've seen, this is really an apolitical reality, which is my school wouldn't open, or we have a 0% proficiency in reading or math, or, my grandparents went to this school and it was terrible. And now, we're here and it's terrible. Or you're making my first grader cover their face all day long. And then you're telling me that doesn't affect their speech acquisition.
Well, Erika, I love everything you guys are doing. I love, how you talk about this issue because it affects everybody. And you're right. It's the positive of COVID is that it impacted everybody at all levels. And that way we all were able to sort of build our voice up. So I appreciate everything you're doing. Where can everybody go to find out more about your organization and what you're doing and how they can support it?
We are at defendinged.org. That is also our handle on Twitter X, is what I call it. We have a Parents Defending Education Facebook page and Instagram, so lots of updates there. And then on our website, we have a ton of resources for people, so people can just kind of go looking. The other thing I would say is we have like a map that tracks incidences of things that we consider to be inappropriate for schools, let's say. And the other thing I would add is like we vet everything. So if something is not, if I don't have primary source documentation that has been vetted and corroborated, it's not going up on our website. So if you're looking for good information that is reliable and trustworthy, then yeah, definitely come into our website. And if you're having a problem in your school or you're not sure about something or whatever, you can always reach out and one of us will get back to you.
Great. Well, Erika, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all for taking the time to tune in and listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.